Hi, my name is Nick. I have an idea for a story. I want to be a writer, and this is where I've been writing. And as you can see, it's a lot messier than usual, and there's been a bit of a gap between videos because of all the amazing, unprecedented things that have occurred in that time, which I want to talk about. So, I guess what I'm trying to discuss in this video, what I'll get into eventually, is conspiracy theories and the idea of conspiracy theories just in general. So I'm cleaning up this space because my partner's sister is coming tomorrow to stay here, and I'll be moving to another bedroom, so I have to clear this place up tonight. But before I did, I thought I'd finally make a video based on all the incredible changes to the world that have happened in the last 2 months since my last video. I've been going to bed really late. I haven't been looking after my health. And I haven't been doing any of those concepts that I thought I would in terms of just managing my time and my health and my intake of substances, like just sugar and alcohol and yeah, I don't look too good. But I've been writing lots. I've been busy, and now it's the school holidays, thank God, for 3 weeks. So I'll use that time to recuperate. Yeah, so there's been some incredible changes to our world in the last time since I've made a video, and I want to talk about those things. I want to talk about perception and statistics, bandwagoning, history, understanding history, and rights, protests, looting, tweeting, and also in this video I want to talk about another tier in the worship pyramid called the Unspoken, and how they relate to another character type called the Sauronids. So I'll get into that now. I'm going to try to do it fast, but it's going to be complicated. Alright, it is cold in New Zealand. It is winter now in Wellington, and just as well, our COVID-19 community transmission is way down, and touching wood now and hoping and praying that COVID-19 is pretty much eradicated from our communities due to the quick decision making of our government and our physical distancing, just being an island nation. I've been putting this video off for a while because I've actually been really depressed, actually, just recently, regarding the last 2 months of international reaction to the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, which I support in terms of the simplistic slogan and its sentiment, of course. I shouldn't have to say, you completely think that something is abhorrent like the death of an unarmed man at the hands of a police officer. But I find myself, amongst others, having to say that, to state the obvious, that what happened to George Floyd at the hands of Derek Chauvin is horrible and criminal and callous. But you shouldn't have to say that. It's complicated. Anyway, to put it simply, I've been quite down about it. I'd say quite depressed, really. I've been staying up way too late. I've been writing heaps. It's been good for writing. I've written a crap load. But now I look like because I haven't been taking my own advice about sleeping well and looking after myself, and I've let my personal appearance completely down. I just stopped shaving one day, and I've grown less, which is actually good for winter, I suppose, but I should do something about this as well. But yeah, I've just been staying up way too late. Sometimes not even writing, sometimes reading, sometimes watching something, sometimes just wasting my time watching the media circus in response to everything that's happened. So it's been a weird couple of months. For everyone, probably. Anyway, I wanted to talk about a few things. And this is in response to my own thoughts, my own perspective on the huge changes in culture that have happened just in the last 2 months. And I don't just mean Black Lives Matter, I mean people reacting to Black Lives Matter. I mean people peacefully protesting around the world. I mean people violently looting. I mean celebrities having to put their own thoughts together and form opinions about the events, and which celebrities and political identities have had to align themselves with one particular thing. People that have stood back, people that have gone on CNN or Fox in America and spoken about it. And it's very messy and complicated, actually, where you'd think that something as abhorrent as killing a man needlessly would be universally disgraced, and that person would be hated and then charged for it. But they have been, and I think that part of all of the movement is about a larger growing consciousness about race around the world. And then comes with race, it means we need to talk about history. And I still have Roots up in my bookcase as a book that I read this year that was not easy to get through. Not because of the way it was written. Sometimes I felt like a little bit because of the way that it was formatted in the book. But more because of the content of the book. But I digress. So 2020 is turning out to be one hell of a year. Bushfires first, then COVID-19, conspiracies around China and America, Trump as usual, and then this. And on May 25th, George Floyd was mercilessly killed by Minnesota police officers, trapped under the knee of the charged and now retired from his duties and internationally disgraced officer Derek Chauvin. And while this event was cruel and criminal and completely unnecessary, it doesn't really represent an odd occurrence in the United States today. It's more a part of a long-standing, growing statistic and that people have noticed. So every day, US police officers fatally shoot an average of 3 people. 3 people. But it's a well-armed population that, vehemently protects the right to bear arms. It's part of their Third Amendment or whatever. So they really want to make sure that they're armed against a government that might become corrupt. Not that there's a lot you can do with sort of like your rifle and shotguns and whatever you're going to have if the government is corrupt and does face you. But it's an outdated model in my belief, like if you're going to, I think there's a couple of comedians that say something along the lines of, if you're going to believe in is it the First Amendment? The First Amendment, the right to bear arms and everything else, you've got to wear what they wore in those days, which was powdered wigs. I don't think there's a need to protect yourself from the government myself. I think that all you need to do to protect yourself really is to have a camera and a phone and we've got that these days. I think that to protect yourself against guns, the only thing that's going to protect you is another gun, and therein lies the success and the issue of America, because the gun lobbyists are more than aware that the only thing that you can use to protect against a gun is a gun to shoot that person first. And it probably accounts for the huge amount of guns that have sneaked into the UK. I mean, I think 30 years ago it was unheard of to think of pistols and handguns and stuff like that is just basically anti-personal guns in the UK. And now they're everywhere throughout gangs, and then as a result, UK police officers also need to be armed with guns, and so it goes. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like an arms race, except there's never going to get a point of an impasse of like a Cold War, because it's you could just keep on amassing more and more guns. So I know it's an issue that can't just be solved easily, and that therein lies basically this whole issue of like race and police and defunding the police and Black Lives Matter and identity crisis and whether people are singled out for it, and how you make sense of that statistics of homicides and gun ownership, and then right wing and left wing in politics. It's an absolute circus. But I think the whole system of having the population being able to arm themselves is basically an outdated model with good intentions, basically. It's interesting that like racism in America remains something that is their scars, but also what defines so much of their culture. When they talk about freedom and liberation and all men created equal, it's always this big asterisk, this big footnote about, well, depends on race, and at what point of time you're talking about when people have got those kind of sentiments. And how was America, how was the greatness created, on the backs of slaves and the cotton industry of the South. And it's a messy one, because you also have to say things like, even the sentiment of like make America great again, there's some people for whom America has never been great, because it's a capitalist society whereby people must be at the bottom rung, and in order for the system to work, that is the system. You can rise and fall in that system. Therein lies the ugliness and the beauty of the concept. So deaths by race due to excessive force, and I say excessive force than gunshot, because you have to remember people like Eric Garner, who were choked to death, and George Floyd also. But the victims of police officers using excessive force were, the majority of them are white at 52%, but disproportionately high amounts of black people at 32%, when they make up only 13% of the population. So basically that means the fatality rate is 2.8 times higher among blacks than whites. Most victims are reported to be armed, 83%, but black victims were more likely to be unarmed at 14.8% than white people at 9.4%. So I guess that's also saying that a lot of unarmed black people are killed by excessive force by police officers, which is again what Black Lives Matter is really trying to communicate. So just for context, the population of USA is 60% white and 13% black, depending on where and when you get those statistics, depending on where and how people define themselves as black and white. Because even though this is talked about all the time in the USA, like, I can't help but think of it in a New Zealand statistic where people say like, oh, I identify as Māori, but I'm less than 6% Māori or whatever. And if you don't look like that race, you might genetically be that race, depending on, again, it becomes a definition, and no one wants to talk about the amount of black that you are. It's more about if you identify as that race, and if you experience through looking or identifying or dressing or being or expressing yourself in that way, that you would also experience the disadvantages associated with that race. And it gets very murky as to whether you are part of that race because you experience the disadvantages that they all experience. But at what rate and at what amount, and where's the scientific control? It's so problematic. Black people in America are disproportionately represented in incarceration. So in the jail system, black males make 34% of the total male prison population, and white males make up 29%. Interestingly, white females make 47% of the prison population, whereas black females only make up 18% of the female population. So there's shows like Orange is the New Black, whatever it's called, that completely misrepresents the jail system and race representation. I think the statistic that police officers and all law officers are quick to note that puts a spanner in the works. Not really, but it's something that isn't mentioned. And it always worries me when there's particular powers that be that sort of try to dodge a particular statistic. And this is it. It's that 52.5% of homicide offenders are black, are African American. 52.5% of homicides are exacted by African Americans, by black people. And that, now, there's a lot of ways to look at the data. Chicken or the egg, ambulance at the bottom of the hill, wrong end of the telescope. What are you looking at here? Like, do you look at it in terms of this is what society has created, this is the inequality, which is like intergenerational from slavery, that has created this issue of people having to turn to crime who are in the lowest rung in a capitalist society? Or do you say there needs to be reparations? Do you say that there needs to be some sort of response so that we pull these people out of the obvious crime circles and gang affiliations that they're in? I mean, simply put, look, are Afro-Americans more likely to die from an interaction with a police officer? And the answer is yes. But it's not as simple as saying that you're black and you should fear for your life when you walk outside the streets. And that is something that I don't like about the Black Lives Matter movement, is it trying to create a slightly skewed and incorrect narrative whereby they think that, or they're trying to make people believe that if you're black and you leave your house, you're more likely to die. That's a statistic that is misleading. It's not as if police officers in your area are signaling you out because you are black to kill you. But that is exactly what the movement is trying to communicate, when it's simply not true. But you can see how, if you can skew the data saying you're more likely to die with a police interaction, and that is true. But why? You have to break it down a little bit and not be misled by these quite bold and paranoia enticing sort of statistics. They're juicy and make good headlines, but there's not a lot of truth to them. Listen, police officers of the same race are more likely to fatally shoot a member of their own race. White and white, Hispanic, Hispanic, black, black, And this is largely related to communities in USA being kind of partitioned by race. There's black towns, white towns, Hispanic, and then areas within that as well. And that, like what I was saying before about like police officers of the same race more likely to kill fatally shoot members of their own race. That's because people from their own community become police officers and then look after that community. There's a massive predominance of homicides within a race rather than outside the race of the criminal. I mean, like intra-race or inter-race. So like there's far more intra-race violence. And what I mean by that is that there's this massive predominance of homicides within a race rather than outside the race of the criminal. And I guess this is what people refer to when they talk about black on black crime, which is a rather hot topic that, again, people don't really want to talk about, which, I don't know. It always raises questions when there's one particular statistic that people don't like and they seem to just sort of like skip around it. And I think if there's going to be a proper discussion about things, all aspects need to be discussed. And I think missing out one piece of data is always going to continue ill communication and misunderstanding between groups of people. And I mean not just groups of people in terms of race, but I mean groups of people in terms of politics as well. So that people, how they're divided is very important these days. There's so many ways to divide the general population around the world. What you believe in, faith-based, politics-based, how you feel about police, how you feel about race, how you feel about reparations, how you feel about history. And, I was just reading something the other day that was quite an eye-opener in terms of, black people who were freed after 1865 and then became settlers and were seen by the First Nations, the native population, as settlers and part of the western expansion of America. But also, you've got American native First Nation that held and kept slaves as well. So it's very complicated. So you've got black people that had that moved into territories and were hated by the American Native Indians, and you've also got those same people that kept slaves beyond the 1865 Juneteenth and the Emancipation Proclamation in Indian reservations. So it's very complicated because I think that the Native Americans and blacks have both got a very good case of systematic racism that's been dealt against them for generations, and some very intense grievances that they should be allowed. There's nothing more complicated than race, I feel, because I think that anything whereby you don't decide that yourself, but you're identified as it, is problematic. If you choose to be Republican or Democratic and you choose to watch one particular news than another, or you watch a merge of the two or you change throughout your life, that's something that you have control over. I've decided to identify as da-da-da-da-da. Especially in this day and age where people are deciding to identify as all sorts of things that go against what in previous generations we would have called natural. Like, you are a man, so therefore you'll be identified as a man. And there's nothing you can do about it. Doesn't matter how you feel about it, doesn't matter what you wear. Every part of your body that can be analysed, from your hair to your toenails to your skin samples and blood, will always show that you are male or female, regardless of how you want to be identified. And in this day and age where we allow people to identify in all sorts of different things in a rainbow of choices of sexuality, you can only fit into particular colours of race. And I find that fascinating, that that same approach of a rainbow and a spectrum and a gradient of race has not been applied. It's like, well, I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm not quite Asian, in fact I'm all three, or I'm more of this than the other. Even in this day and age when you could actually accurately be able to tell people a proportion and a percentage using a DNA sample, you know, and yet we're still stuck in black, white, Asian, Hispanic. It's very strange. And also even the terms white, black, it's like this bipolar opposite, like off, on, up, down. But like I said, you know, America has scars that define it. Most crime is intraracial. 94% of black victims of homicide are killed by black people. 86% of white victims are killed by white people. So that makes sense in terms of the ghettos that seem to develop in America, of and communities and cities that are very much more segregated than they are in New Zealand. Trump tweeted this totally bogus statistic that confused police killings with homicides and accidental police. It was a complete mess. I can't believe anyone took it seriously, but the end result was something like 97%, or not saying 98% of black victims are killed by black people. Now, the unfortunate thing about that statistic is that it's insanely wrong, and a lot of people get the wrong end of the stick. But the sad part of it is that there's an element of truth to that as well, which needs to be addressed through changing how those conditions are created. But that's not a conversation that is likely to occur if misinformation is being flung around all the time. According to the study from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, there was 1,001 people killed in 2019 by police officers. Half of them were white, and a quarter of them were black. So again, disproportionately high for 13% of the population. And according to the Washington Post, and this is a quote, the rate at which black Americans are killed by police is more than twice as high as the rate for white Americans. You know? So, all that is clear, really, in the final analysis of all of these different statistics from places and sources, is that black Americans, for a variety of reasons, ranging from looking like the suspect to being the perpetrator, they are 2.5 times more likely than a white person to be shot by police. But that doesn't mean that when you leave the house and another person leaves the house, if one person's black and one person's white, they're 2.5 times more likely to be killed. Even though the statistics would say that. It's taken out of context, I suppose. But I think for a lot of people that are spouting these types of easily remembered and controversial and good headline statistics are forgetting that context that's super important. Also, the other thing is that you can talk about it and then say, well, hang on, well, why? Why does that happen? And take a step back from it. Why is that statistic so high? Why are black Americans more likely to commit those crimes, or more likely to be signaled out by police officers? Why are they more likely to die with a police interaction? And take it from there. But it's only the tip of the iceberg that's really being seen and complained about. And I think that there needs to be a discussion, but the whole problem needs to be analyzed and taken apart. And you know what? In the final analysis, it'll probably come down to something like long intergenerational disadvantages caused by slavery. I'm sure it would be. So, following George Floyd's death was June 19th, 1865, when all slaves in Texas were finally declared free. A whole 2.5 years later, after the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln. And it's perfect timing as well for the inequalities of COVID-19 death rates that are disproportionately represented amongst Black Americans as well. So it's a long line of things, like you've got this horrible death that's filmed and absorbed very quickly through social media and all across the US, and everyone's talking about it, everyone's seeing it, everyone's commenting on it, and that was following COVID-19 and people self-isolating and quarantine and job market being affected by that, and people going out of work, people becoming frustrated, and then Juneteenth comes along as well. So, but I mean, like I said at the beginning of the video, like, this is not an odd event in itself, George Floyd dying at the hands of a police officer. You also have to understand that it's a long line of people that have died, that have been unarmed, that have died at the hands of police officers for a variety of reasons as well. But there's Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Rashad Brooks. So there's an organized movement advocating for non-violent civil disobedience in protest against incidents of brutality like this against African American people, called Black Lives Matter. And has received unprecedented media attention due to the protests related to that, and the slogans and the Twitter handles about it. It's led to a lot of peaceful protests that have, in a lot of instances, have transformed into looting in a lot of American cities, following months of COVID-19 related work shortages and self-isolation, quarantine, and general madness. And then the monuments of racist individuals from the past began to be pulled down, kind of like cancel culture, becoming embodied as something physical. Edward Colston in Bristol was probably one of the most famous ones that I saw that were pulled down, famously pulled down in Bristol and thrown into the harbour. But, some statues have been mislabeled with a worrying disregard for history, like Winston Churchill and Abraham Lincoln, which is bizarre, So I saw an interesting article on Victoria University of Wellington's site called "Don't Hide Statues Away to Be Forgotten." Had some interesting little tidbits in it. So it says this: historical figures are rarely perfect and rarely purely evil. Instead, most have complicated, challenging stories we can only properly understand through education. Education is also required to understand the selection of these figures, who often represent a narrow band of humanity. So in New Zealand, we've got Captain Cook, who is often discussed about related to colonialism and his part to play in it. So he was the captain of the English ships that came to make New Zealand what it is today. And what I mean by that is a part of the British Empire, whereas Abel Tasman, who was a Dutch explorer, discovered New Zealand, but didn't represent a colonial movement to take New Zealand from the natives, so to speak. But Captain Cook, it goes on in this article, Captain Cook made significant contributions to navigation and exploration, but is part of a legacy of colonialism and poor treatment of indigenous peoples that continues to play a role in society to this day. Now, his statue in Gisborne has been defaced many times. There's also Governor Gray, who's in Auckland next to the university I went to, and he's been beheaded multiple times. There's no right answer to how we should remember these figures and statues. They come with significant achievements and often major failings. The only answer for me is that neither aspect of these figures should be forgotten. History must be allowed to hold and it must be told in full, warts and all. And that's kind of what I'm saying, is that we should look at these figures, keep their statues, remember what they have done, good things, bad things, what they represent, what part of history they were part of, so that we don't forget history. So there's a couple of things that have really got me worrying in terms of a kind of like conspiracy theorist, as I kind of tend to think of things. I'm worried about things, and I often think that the biggest conspiracy theory of all is the general populace's reaction to conspiracy theories in general, in that you should not believe them, don't listen to anyone who's got any conspiracy theories. It makes me worried that anything controversial is just downplay, don't be ridiculous. And yet you look back in history at all sorts of issues and you find out it was a cover-up on a cover-up, and there were tapes and Watergate and JFK's brain, and it's like, what? People were worrying at the time. It's like, yeah, but everyone just said it was crazy talk. And there's a couple of things that are worrying me. I mean, the bricks that mysteriously were dropped off at venues where protests were then transformed into looting. No one knows who dropped off these bricks, despite the fact that there's cameras all over American cities. I think a few cameras got them, but then they were just an unmarked truck that just dropped off some bricks on a pallet and left. There's an unclear relation to Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and I am not a fan of Antifa at all. I think that their aims are basically just to destroy America as it exists, not to repair it, not to reform it, not to question it from within and to edit it, but to just break it down. Another thing I really don't like is cancel culture, digging up these past issues or past grievances, past events and things that people have done wrong, but to be judged in the current cultural climate, I think is really unfair. But what is Black Lives Matter? And is there an end game? Is there a point to the success that they wish to reach? Because I think, like with most goals, like write a book in a year, it needs to have a time to it, so by the end of the time whether you've done it or not, such as within this year I want to write this book. Also, what does it mean to write a book? Does it mean it's in some sort of finished state? Does it mean it's edited? Does it mean it's off to a publisher? Does it mean it's been published? So it needs clear definitions. But the aims of Black Lives Matter is, and this is from the official website, we work vigorously for freedom and justice for black people and by extension all people. It's really hard to argue with that. That sounds good. All right. We intentionally build and nurture a beloved community that is bonded together through a beautiful struggle that is restorative, not depleting. It is great. Now, they use comrades, but they are aiming to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages. And I guess that's to do with some of the other issues that the black community face, such as absent fathers, which is another thing that, for whatever reason, they don't want to talk about. There's so many ways to have reported things without mentioning race. I mean, imagine if it was another criminal that didn't have a father. This makes a disproportionate amount of people that are incarcerated that had fathers that were absent. But they won't mention that. They won't, because it's more it just gets more clicks if they mention race. But there's a lot of disinformation out there, especially with Black Lives Matter. I don't think that there's anything wrong with those issues, and like everything else to do with Black Lives Matter, it's very hard to disagree with the sentiment, the idea. I do remain concerned over the 1984 kind of overtones of people being fired or socially ostracized for angering the powers that be that represent Black Lives Matter. There's a worrying kind of Animal Farm-esque tone to the way they conduct themselves in a way. It makes me worried when NBA announcers get fired for saying all lives matter. Kind of somewhat innocently, I suppose, but then NBA is also the same corporation and sporting industry that's got China calling the shots just around its little finger, like about not allowed to support the Hong Kong riots, for example. Will Smith said something interesting. Racism is not getting worse, it's getting filmed. And that made me think about the impact of the George Floyd video in terms of its rapid absorption of the collective consciousness over the actual act itself and over the actual statistics, the emotional response. I heard a quote by Joe Rogan as well discussing this. in context of the Evergreen University sort of uprisings, which is now a few years ago, but is with Brett Weinstein, who was a lecturer there, and who really fought back about the Evergreen protests, which were completely unnecessary and completely ridiculous, and resulted in him losing his job and having to move and all these other things. And it was a completely unfounded call that he was racist. It completely unfounded. But is this all a distraction? Is this part of a larger conspiracy? And that's kind of what I want to talk about, is conspiracy theories just in general. The unspoken elements that go on in the background when we have things that affect all of culture or all of society. There's I believe sometimes that there's a background mechanic at play, playing things out so that we are led to believe certain things on an average while something else is happening. Distraction is one of the biggest things that worries me about this new social media, because very quickly everyone's talking about one thing and they've forgotten the other thing. Like COVID-19, for example. Like, everyone's just saying, yeah, but we have to fight the virus of racism. It's like, but that's not a real virus. That's not even technically a virus. Plus, you're taking these statistics way out of context, and this might not be the best time to represent it. Oh, well, if not now, when? Maybe you've got a point. Maybe this needs to be done in a different way than a big, massive, physical protest. But the most annoying thing is that the same people that were talking about how important it was not to meet in public completely turned a blind eye or didn't want to complain at all about the protests at all. It just gets me suspicious, I suppose. Well, it's winter and it's cold, so I've grown a beard. I'll probably get rid of it pretty soon. I don't think it suits me, but it's just a case of being lazy at this point. And also I have to admit, I've actually been thoroughly depressed in the last month at least, and I've definitely given up putting much effort into my public appearance. It started with just not shaving, and then not getting a haircut regularly as I normally would, and I just got to a stage where it would have been kind of weird to sort of like maintain any kind of haircut or beard length, and so I just let it grow. And but I think I'm gonna sort myself out, because I feel really out of shape and really flabby, and I've been looking after myself at all. I've been going to bed mega late, like midnight, 1 a.m, sometimes writing, sometimes just wasting my time, sometimes just staying up and reading and wondering. And I think what I've spent a lot of the time on is going in between things like videos about what's happening in our world right now, specifically with, stuff about Black Lives Matter. And even though people aren't mentioning George Floyd as much as they were, because it's about a global change in response to police brutality. But it's a complicated matter, because I just re-listened to Animal Farm by George Orwell. It wasn't that long ago. I think the last time I was in Nelson, actually, like, I started reading 1984 again. So it's in the back of my mind whenever I hear things that are Orwell-esque, such as people disagreeing with the status quo and being socially ostracized or fired for questioning this sort of grand and highly acclaimed movement kind of worries me. It's like the changing rules they have in Animal Farm, or the changing countries that Oceania is fighting against in 1984. You know, the rules seem to change based on who's saying it and when you're saying it, and that does worry me. And it's never been a case of disagreeing with the sentiment of Black Lives Matter. It just makes me cautious about the right to voice your own opinions about these things. And it's not as if anyone were to disagree with the sentiment of Black Lives Matter. A very few people would, I suppose. There's some very sick, twisted individuals that might find an issue with the message itself. But it is apparently a non-profit organization and a movement or in a hashtag, but it does operate like a business, because they have merchandise, they have a site, they are an organization, they have chapters, and I don't know what to think about it. I'm very much removed about all this in New Zealand, but we're all connected as a international global village, and I can't help but understand and know what's happening in the States right now, because we're part of the same culture, you know, like music and art and shows and entertainment. The worries and concerns and focus that the media and therefore everybody else and Twitter and all of the actors that we aspire to and we look up to have commented on it. So we're not in isolation here. And all this is going on and is, you know, at the same time as COVID-19, where isolation really does mean something, like a physical distancing from everything is a world of difference. You know, like COVID-19 in New Zealand is very small. We're acting very much as we did a year ago today. Here, largely unaffected by it. There's been like little tiny spikes about it, and then trying to put it in the news every day when there's 2 new cases. It's just because we're finding someone out in the woodworks. But largely in New Zealand, COVID-19 has been, I need to touch wood, but like eradicated or sort of overcome. And a lot of that is to do with the government being quite quick in response, but also due to our physical distancing as a country and being quite isolated. So I've been putting this off for quite a while because it's quite a serious issue, and I needed some clarity to make sense of the statistics and facts and how people were reacting to it online and elsewhere. So lots of things to talk about. There's going to be some things that are controversial, obviously, and some things that I'm choosing not because I'm filming it, but because I just don't want to really have an opinion about it. I don't think I have any right to have an opinion about it, but my commentary on some facts is based on me, is reliant on me believing them at face value. And perhaps they're wrong, you know, like statistics. I remember my statistics teacher actually telling me that the amount of statistical data that is skewed, you know, can completely change the message of the graph or the information that you're being showed. If it uses numbers, then perhaps looking at it again in terms of percentages completely changes the point of the graph existing. Not always, but often the data can be heavily skewed by the way that it's presented. But notwithstanding all that, I needed some distance from the death of George Floyd on May 25th of this year to digest how I was going to make sense of it and how to react to everybody else's reactions over the movement and the accusations of police brutality and the cancel culture that's pervasive right now, and the statues being pulled down, and the changes to culture just in general. It's fascinating, it's worrying, it's invigorating, it's inspiring, it's all a bit scary. And 2020 is turning out to be one hell of a year, considering it started off with the bushfires that we thought were going to be one of the biggest sort of events of the year. So, in the aftermath of all this is not in the aftermath, but in the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the May 25th, George Floyd was mercilessly killed by Minnesota police officers, trapped under the knee of the now charged and retired from his duties and internationally disgraced officer Derek Chauvin. And while this event was definitely cruel and criminal, it doesn't really even represent an odd occurrence in the United States today. It's a long string of events. So every day, US police officers fatally shoot an average of 3 people. Now, it's a very well-armed population. There's an amendment in America which is vehemently protected about the right to bear arms, and that to protect themselves from a government, and they're allowed to form militias. It's all a bit of an outdated model, really, in my opinion, based on sort of centuries-old concepts of government and militias. And I mean, what good would any weapon do against an army or a well-funded police force? There's no competition. But I think at some point in history, it may have actually accounted for something. It may have actually meant something. So, well, you're allowed to arm yourselves so that we don't get out of line as a government. And I think that there was perhaps a point to that, but it's an outdated model. Nevertheless, these are the statistics of black and white violence in America. And some of them are controversial. Some of them have been retweeted by that idiot Trump, which are completely wrong. I mean, you can tell that they're bogus from the get-go when he tweeted it. But the interesting thing about all of this is that racism stays in America. Like, the scars of America's past define it. So much of American identity has been affected by their call of liberty and freedom for all, and the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. It all comes back to slavery. And I don't think they'll ever get over it. I don't think it'll ever be sort of this wound that will nicely heal over. It's messy and it's complicated. And at the same time, it's incredibly basic and fundamental. Difficult to move past sort of event in America's history. It's not really ever going to be completely forgotten, and it shouldn't be. But I think it's important to note that there should always be an end point goal whereby people striving for something will realize that they've succeeded in something. And I think, like when I set goals with students, it's usually because you need to know where you're going so that you know when you've got there. And it seems so obvious. But if you don't, you cannot actually achieve that goal. A goal must be timed, should be timed. So within this year, I plan to make a book, for example. That's a good one. So by the end of the year, if I haven't, I have not reached that goal. And then you have to define exactly what it is and what you mean by writing the book. Do you mean that you've written a whole bunch of words? Do you mean written the final edit? Do you mean it's published or ready to be published, or not afraid to show your friends your book? So I have to work out those specific definitions myself. But I think it's important with all goals that there's some sort of end point where you can say that it's been reached. So, Abraham Lincoln's proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, is declaring that slaves are free. It took another 2.5 years before Texas caught up with Juneteenth when they did also. But it's weird that that's celebrated as more of an event, and wants to be, and America wants that to be a public holiday over the Emancipation Proclamation. But anyway, I think that's like the final straw against slavery at that point, and so that's why it becomes Emancipation Day or Jubilee Day or Freedom Day or Juneteenth. But every day, US police officers kill 3 people. And it's a dangerous, very, very well-armed population due to that amendment about the right to bear arms and protect yourself from the government, depending on which state you're in. Along with all of this, I think police officers will be quick to remind people that African Americans account for 52.5% of all homicide offences, and that make up 13% of the population. And I think that's something that I've heard people like Candace Owen say, and a couple of other black people that identify with right-wing politics, and they're not afraid to say that statistics, but it's not a popular thing to say. And I think it sort of becomes a chicken or the egg sort of situation, or which end of the telescope you want to do, or do you want the ambulance at the bottom of the hill. You can choose your analogy, but a lot of the time they don't really want to concentrate on that fact, because it either justifies some of the police brutality or the police suspicion of black people and the amount of black suspects in homicides, and people that look like someone are going to be treated like a criminal until they're proven innocent, which is, thank God it's not the way in New Zealand, but it is in America, and people are very suspicious and quick to respond because everybody can carry an arm, can carry a weapon. So police officers have to be on guard constantly, just when anyone's moving down to retrieve a weapon. Hell of a job, police officers. So yeah. So there's so many ways to approach this. Start, like I said, like the chicken or the egg. What came first? Is it the reflection of society and criminals being forced into it? People in a lower rung of society being forced into a life of crime and then incarceration as a result of how they are treated in society and where they are. And that could go back to disadvantages caused by slavery. I'm sure that Jordan Peterson has actually made quite a good case to say that all of the disadvantages that Afro-Americans say that they experience relate back to inequality caused by, initially, through slavery. So are Afro-Americans more likely to die from an interaction with a police officer? Yes, they are. But why are they? That's because of a whole host of reasons related to that's quite controversial statistic I mentioned before. Also suspicious police officers and a very, very well-armed population of paranoid people. But the thing is that you have to understand like intra-racial and interracial sort of like violence in America. So I find it weird because in New Zealand I think of us more of an intermingling population, and some people might correct me on that, but I always feel like when I go to my local supermarket, I'm interacting with all sorts of races and creeds and colours of people, and I think those differences would be more noticeable if we were in ghetto-like formations of communities where we didn't interact with each other. And apparently, according to Americans, it's more like the former. It's more like this city is more black, this city is more white, this one's more Hispanic, this is more Asian, and I find it strange. I mean, like, I know that there's like Chinatown and Korean sub communities within cities, sure, but I think in New Zealand, or I'd like to think in New Zealand, maybe I'm being naive, that those differences are not that obvious and we don't keep to our own. But I don't know, it's hard to it's made me reappraise a lot of things just in the last 2 months. But anyway, police officers of the same race are way more likely to fatally shoot a member of their own race. But this is largely related to communities in the USA being basically partitioned by race, and those people of the community becoming police officers and working within that same community. So statistics are closely analysed and they're incredibly controversial, as you'd expect them to be. There's this ridiculous one Trump tweeted, some bogus table that lumped homicides with police shootings, necessary and accidental shootings all together in one, concentrating and making this bold assumption that 97% of homicides were black people killing other black people. And while most crime is intra-racial, there is a statistic that's going around that I think is wrong. It couldn't possibly be right, but there's 94% of black victims of homicide are killed by black people. 94%. But then there's another, in that same statistic, 86% of white victims are white people. So I guess that would make sense if they are as segregated as people say they are in America. In 2019, police officers shot and killed 1,001 people. So the year before this, 1,001 people died. About half of those killed were white, and 1/4 were black, which is disproportionate for 13% of the population. The rate at which black Americans are killed by police is more than twice as high as the rate for white Americans. And I guess what this whole movement is about statistics like that don't seem to make sense and speak of inequality and racially related hate crimes within law enforcement. All that is clear is that black Americans, for a variety of reasons that have gone on, spanning from looking like a suspect to being the actual perpetrator themselves, they're 2.5 times more likely than a white person to be shot by the police. So just for context, the population of USA is 60% white and 13% black, depending on where and when you get those statistics, and depending on where and how people define themselves as black and white, because even though this is talked about all the time in the USA, I can't help but think of it in a New Zealand statistic where people will say like, oh, I identify as Māori, but I'm less than 6% Māori or whatever. And if you don't look like that race, you might genetically be that race, depending on, again, it becomes a definition, and no one wants to talk about the amount of black that you are. It's more about if you identify as that race, and if you experience through looking or identifying or dressing or being or expressing yourself in that way, that you would also experience the disadvantages associated with that race. And it gets very murky as to whether you are part of that race because you experience the disadvantages that they all experience, but at what rate and at what amount, and where's the scientific control? I mean, it's so problematic. Do you look at it in terms of this is what society has created, this is the inequality which is like intergenerational from slavery that has created this issue of people having to turn to crime who are in the lowest rung in a capitalist society? Or do you say there needs to be reparations? Do you say that there needs to be some sort of response so that we pull these people out of the obvious crime circles and gang affiliations that they're in? I mean, simply put, look, are Afro-Americans more likely to die from an interaction with a police officer? And the answer is yes. But it's not as simple as saying that you're black and you should fear for your life when you walk outside the streets. And that is something that I don't like about the Black Lives Matter movement, is it trying to create a slightly skewed and incorrect narrative whereby they think that, or they're trying to make people believe that if you're black and you leave your house, you're more likely to die. That's a statistic that is misleading. It's not as if police officers in your area are signaling you out because you are black to kill you. But that is exactly what the movement is trying to communicate. And it's simply not true. But you can see how if you can skew the data saying you're more likely to die with a police interaction, and that is true. But why? You have to break it down a little bit and not be misled by these quite bold and paranoia enticing sort of statistics. They're juicy and make good headlines, but there's not a lot of truth to them. Listen, police officers of the same race are more likely to fatally shoot a member of their own race. White and white, Hispanic, black, black, you know. And this is largely related to communities in USA being kind of partitioned by race. You know, there's black towns, white towns, Hispanic, and then areas within that as well. And that, like what I was saying before about like police officers of the same race more likely to kill, fatally shoot members of their own race. That's because people from their own community become police officers and then look after that community. Conspiracy theories just in general, I've always had a certain appeal. Ever since really I was 19 and I watched the Twin Towers come down, and I started questioning and researching, and I think what really made it more appealing than anything else and enticing was the fact that people didn't want me to do it, that didn't want me to question it. And I thought that something was there because of that. When people said, like, what are you doing? Why are you questioning that? You shouldn't do that. And it made me think that there was something there, like there was an actual resistance to it. And the same sort of thing with people downplaying conspiracy theories or universally saying that all people who believe in conspiracy theories are crazy. It makes me think all the more reason to investigate, which might not be the best, most logical reasoning, but it does make me think sometimes that what is most important to stay hidden is hidden the best, or is more juicy to find, or what is best hidden is most rewarding to unearth. And I do think that there's some unsolved issues around 9/11, and it's almost to the point where it's incredulous to believe that the United States allowed it to happen, or that at that level allowed it to occur. But it's not like this is completely unbelievable, because the United States Army and the military industrial complex has done all sorts of things that seem like out of the pages of a science fiction or a film, that they're so unbelievable. I mean, you can take the CIA use of LSD on prisoners. I mean, the history of America and the military-industrial complex and the US government is full of completely unbelievable facts, like Project MKUltra, where LSD was taken en masse back to the United States from Switzerland, where it was manufactured, and given out to Hell's Angels and hippies, and to try to basically disrupt the movement of the anti-war protest movement, and experimented on within the CIA and within agents and on random people to see if LSD was useful to try to get people to change their political agenda. So if they could become communist or from communist to capitalist. Everything that happened during the Vietnam War and Nixon and Watergate, the Clinton administration, and all the sordid stuff that happened during that time. 9/11 wouldn't surprise me at all if you unearth it and you find that the event itself was allowed to occur or was somehow part of a bigger plan. It wouldn't surprise me whatsoever. I don't know if it is or not, and maybe we'll never know. But I think that people's resistance to looking for more information about the JFK unanswered questions of like, yeah, but there were more than one bullet. You know, like there's certain questions that I hate the way that people just sort of dodge around it. Say, oh yeah, but don't be silly. Yeah, I think I will concentrate on that one bit of event. But I digress, because what I want to talk about really is how much I like crazy people like David Icke, who have gone way beyond the usual sort of conspiracy theorist ideas to involve everything like the moon is hollow and there's a conspiracy around basically everything, like there's aliens. But one of his most popular ones, I think that he's most renowned for, is his lizard people. And I think that, in my belief, the lizard people are the ultimate crazy conspiracy theories. They right up the top of all of them, because you're literally saying that there's people that are not human that live amongst us. And I think that is fascinatingly crazy. But I love it. So I wanted to create a character type that is basically related to the lizard people trope. And I thought of a name called Sauronid, which is kind of like dinosaur-esque Sauronid. And I wanted to have the basic idea is that Sauronids eat or consume the energy of the gods of Eden on their 10,000th day. And your 10,000th day, because in the worship pyramid, in my book, a day is referred to as a cycle. So on their 10,000th cycle, which is 27 years and about 4 months, they quickly fall from grace from being incredibly popular followers and influencers and deciders of fashion or music or influence or of any other impact on culture, and they disappear and they meet a Sauronid who has been arranged to meet them on that day, on their 10,000th cycle, and their essence and their energy is sucked out of them and consumed by the Sauronid. And so this brought up a whole lot of ideas about like free range, like the gods of Eden are free range entities. which I like the idea of. The idea is that Sauronids are in fact evolved versions of what dinosaurs would become, but they originate from another version of planet Earth that did not get hit by the meteor that ended the dinosaurs. And so they represent another Earth that narrowly missed that meteor but continued in another forked existence. But somehow the Unspoken, which is a secret cultish sect of society that manages the Sauronids, communicates with them, and arranges for the gods of Eden to meet them, is really the big sort of like secret society. And I want them to have like symbols related to Illuminati, like the all-seeing eye and the pyramid and everything else. So I want the Unspoken to be the super top secret, and they arrange the Sauronids to exist in the actual worship pyramid world and meet the gods of Eden that they will consume the energy of. And when they do so, when they consume a god of Eden, it's almost like they experience an orgasm of some sort, but it's a psychic orgasm, and the energy is transferred back to their plane of existence on this other Earth that didn't get hit by a meteor. And what this does is it disrupts the imagery of Earth so that a much larger threat that I'm going to talk about in my next video cannot locate Earth. That's basically the idea. I don't really want to talk too much about what the Unspoken is, because there's going to be lots of hints in the book, but not a lot of actually like telling what they are, which is what I want to do. They're supposed to be mysterious and secret and cult-like and conspiratorial and all those other good things. But the Sauronids are these horrible creatures that when they're revealed to you, just like lizard people, they're actually like there's a magnetic force field around them that make them seem humanistic, but they're not at all. And this can be broken down and seen through in certain lights, and when the magnetic force field is tampered with, then it falls away, and you can see what they really look like. So I've been making heaps and heaps of parallel stories, and when I mean parallel stories, I mean it's going to be in the worship pyramid, and they're kind of like, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use two different types of text, like italics and non-italics, and basically I'm going to have the real story about Malachi and Awen, who are gods that want to escape their system and become free because they know that they're going to be eaten on their 10,000th day. And they escape the system and they meet up with 981, who's a Guildborg, and all that other stuff that is the worship pyramid story itself. But I want to intersperse that, like alternate every chapter with a parallel story that may or may not be a simulation of an imagined simulation of the other characters. So I've got the goth scene in Yorkshire in the mid-1980s that I've written. That's one. I've got two New Zealand boys that create an online presence about the same time as the goth one, sort of in the 1980s as well, using a precursor modem and a modified game system, and they create this kind of another presence that will be talked about way later in the book, so it's sort of foreshadowing. Written that one. An obese New Zealand software developer is asked to design an entity that can be asked difficult ethical issues, and programmed by the writings of Confucius and a range of other philosophers. And that happens in China just before COVID-19.